Well, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Hannah Theaker, who is going to talk to us tonight. And I would like to thank all of you very much for attending and extend a warm welcome to all of you. Hannah is known well to the RAS because she was a recent finalist for the RAS Bailey Prize in 2020 with her thesis. So Hannah's a historian working on religion and empire in late imperial China, and she has a particular interest in the Northwest. She completed a DPhil at the University of Oxford, and this included a year and a half of fieldwork in China, largely spent in libraries and mosques in the Northwest. She was the Plumer Junior Research Fellow in Oriental Studies at St. Anne's College until recently, and is now a visiting fellow at the Dickson Poon University of Oxford China Centre. Her work has been published in the Qing History Journal in Chinese, and also she has several articles forthcoming soon. She's presently engaged writing her first monograph based on her thesis research. And I'm very pleased that she's here with us because she's had problems with a leaky boat and rain and damp. So thank you very much, Hannah, for being with us tonight. And I'm going to hand over to you and your presentation. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much. First up, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. So thank you to the Royal Asiatic Society for hosting me, and it was an honor to be shortlisted for the prize. Next up, I'm just going to start sharing my screen. So hopefully, can everyone see that?
Yes, that's fine.
Yeah, in which case I will get started. So yeah, it's a pleasure to see everyone and a pleasure to be here tonight. So first up, really at the outset, and especially with a topic like mine, working on the history of Islam in China, I'd like to briefly recognize that there is a genocide happening in Xinjiang at present, which is being conducted in the name of de-extremification and the Sinicization of Islam. For all that I do not work on Xinjiang, I work on what can be termed the interior Northwest, on the provinces of Gansu, Qinghai, Ningxia, Shanxi, and on Chinese Muslims rather than on the Uyghurs and the Kazakhs, who are the primary targets of what is happening in Xinjiang. There are clear and uncomfortable parallels in my work, and it's something that I did not intend to get into when I started this topic back in the early sort of, well, in some respects, I've been working on this topic the entirety of my academic career, so since about 2008. But certainly when I began a PhD, I did not anticipate there being this number of clear and uncomfortable parallels in my work to what is currently happening in China. However, I'd like to state at the outset that contemporary state policy and Islamophobia in China is not just about the past, and nor is it always justified in historical terms. It would be too simplistic to draw a direct connection between the 19th century in China and what is happening at present. But my work does form a little known chapter of the history of Islam in China. And hopefully in bringing this history to light, I'm able to speak to the diversity and the complexity of some of that world. Anyway, on to the actual title of this talk, China's Little Mecca, which some of you may have heard of or may not. China's Little Mecca is almost a set phrase now, used to refer to the town of Ningxia in Gansu. In my work, it often appears as Hezhou, its old name, literally river town. And it has very much become one of these things that is rolled out every time this particular town comes up in contemporary discourse. It's, and the image that is called to mind is very much like the one in front of you, a Chinese town, but dominated by this landscape of minarets and mosques known for its Islamic heritage. In terms of where exactly it is, it's a town in the northwest of Gansu, northwest of China even. It's not actually a particularly big place either. It is a relatively small county town, but nevertheless, it has this disproportionate importance in terms of the way that people talk about Islam in China. In terms of its local geography, it appears at first even more remote. It's at the edge very much of a Tibetan world, really. Not far from the famous Labrang Monastery, one of the biggest Tibetan monasteries outside of Tibet itself. Not far from the provincial capital of Lanzhou. But nevertheless, it's always been a question for me, like, how did this one town, otherwise fairly unremarkable, come to be quite so important within the history of Islam in China? This name, Little Mecca, it appears actually to be a 20th century coinage. Fletcher says it first appeared in around 1945 in an Arabic language introduction to Islam in China by Muhammad Tawadu Pang Shetian, a Hunanese scholar who spent years studying and writing in Cairo. But it's been picked up by almost every other writer since, because it does seem to capture something about how the town appears to people, this densely Islamic enclave, renowned for its mosques as a center for Sufism in China. The town itself, it should be said, has quite a mixed relationship with its heritage. Relationships between Chinese Muslims and Hui, Chinese Muslims, known as Hui, and the Han, are often tense. The town oscillates between celebrating its heritage as a draw for tourists and downplaying it, even prior to the current Sinification of Islam campaign. And when we're talking about Islam as China's Little Mecca, what we're really talking about actually is a suburb of Ningxia, a place called Bafang, which stood outside the old city walls, so never actually inside the formal settlement, to the south of what would have been Ningxia town. The name Bafang means essentially the 8 mosque communities, the 8 Jamaat, and is a reference to the 8 major mosques of long heritage that stand within that community, although there are in fact rather more than that. There's about 27 at present. But that divide between the old towns, between the old walled settlement of Ningxia and the suburb of Bafang, is still actually pretty stark today as well. Bafang is lower rise, it's more tumble down. It's noticeably more Muslim than Ningxia proper. As you cross the line where the walls once stood, because of course they have now been knocked down, you return back to a much more normal town in the northwest, in northwestern terms. It looks much more Han. But today I'm taking on this question of why it is that Ningxia, Hezhou, of all places, became China's Little Mecca. And I'd like to argue that there is a process that underpins that has been underappreciated in most of the present literature on it. Yes, Ningxia does have a number of very old mosques. The Jungian Mosque there is said to have been founded in the 13th century, and there's a handful of other mosques, most of which date back to the Ming. But there's no shortage of very old mosques in Gansu and Qinghai and the northwest of China. Wuwei and the Hershey corridor is of similar age. The Xi'an Great Mosque in Shanxi is older still, dates normally said to date back to the Tang. And obviously, both of these cities historically are much more important, really, than Hezhou, Ningxia as it's now known. I mean, that's not to say that Ningxia is entirely insignificant. It was an important town for Sino-Tibetan trade, and it's an important military base through its Ming-Qing history, its location right on sort of the frontiers of sort of the Sino-Tibetan world. But today, at least, it has a density unlike anywhere else in China, particularly in terms of the concentration of Sufi orders found there. And the majority of Chinese Sufi orders have some presence in the town. And hence, in that sense, today, it truly is China's Little Mecca, as for those adherents of those Sufi orders, it is a pilgrimage center. But as I sort of said already, today I'm going to argue, slightly provocatively, that although Hezhou does have a long history and as an Islamic center, its unique status in the present is a modern artifact. A result, in fact, of the transformation of Islamic geography that followed the Great Northwestern Rebellion, 1862 to 77, and the resettlements of Muslims that were enacted in its wake, which left Hezhou, Ningxia, as basically the only Muslim center left, disrupting old roots of trade and pilgrimage and forming new ones of patronage, and that the history of particularly Chinese Islam, that is Islam as practiced by Chinese Muslims, does not make sense unless we take into account this series of historical ruptures and the way in which they've remade this religious geography, this landscape. So I'd like to go back, and if we're going to talk about basically how things changed, you've got to talk a bit about how they were. And so just to re-emphasize again, I'm talking today largely about the interior northwestern provinces. So Gansu, Qinghai, Ningxia, Shanxi. And the group I'm dealing with are mostly, although not entirely, now known as the Hui, Chinese-speaking Muslims, who are, in the contemporary moment, classed as an ethnic group, and number about 20 million people. I'm not talking about Xinjiang, and I'm not talking about the Turkic Muslim population, but anybody who's interested in the aftermath of what this same rebellion did to Xinjiang and that area is highly recommended to go seek out my colleague Eric Schlussel's recently published book titled Lands of Strangers, which is a fantastic explanation of what this same period did for those populations. I'd like to take a moment also to acknowledge essentially the long-term presence of Muslims in China. Muslims are found all across China, but it is true that there are larger concentrations of population in the northwest, largely in particular regions of Gansu and Ningxia. And there have been Muslims recorded in this particular bit of China for over 1,000 years, and in significant numbers from the Ming dynasty. Some are believed to have arrived as former soldiers settled by various imperial armies. Some arrived as traders coming in from Central Asia, from the trade routes known as the Silk Road. And some were converts to Islam as well, although that is quite hard to actually track. But I'd like to emphasize again that this is a population who has been in this bit of the world for a very, very long time. They are not new, they are not incomers, they are not migrants. They are a part of this world and have been for centuries. However, it does make sense, and in that sense, it does make sense to think in terms of a Muslim religious geography to the northwest of China. A geography that does look, in fact, quite a lot of the time like a geography of trade routes. The mosques and the shrine networks that ran down the He corridor, linking Xi'an to Xinjiang, linking Lanzhou to the Turkic Salar Muslim communities in Qinghai, and eventually all the way to Lhasa as well. It's a geography that was always alive with movement, trade caravans and pilgrims being at the heart of this particular set of historical networks. And it's quite different from the Qing administrative governance that was in play for most of the period that I'm talking about. It bridges the divides between direct and indirect governance, so between sort of the governance of the interior of China as found in Gansu and the governance of populations in Tibet or Qinghai, and likewise into Xinjiang as well. And in that sense, it forms a set of connections that otherwise, and circulations that otherwise tend to be missed in, particularly in imperial accounts of the history of this place in this time period. Religiously speaking, prior to the rebellion that I'm going to talk about in some more detail in the middle of the 19th century, the key development for understanding Islam in this area prior to that is the arrival of Sufism, which took off in the northwest of China from around the mid-17th century, and the development of institutional forms of Sufism to go along that. So the slide here shows the grave of one of the most famous, actually, of the Sufi masters, which forms essentially a node within the Sufi networks as a site of pilgrimage for initiates into a Sufi tradition and sort of a center of gravity for those Sufi networks. And there are a number of these that became extremely locally influential across the northwest of China throughout sort of the 17th and 18th centuries. The key thing to note here really is that in the figure of the Sheikh, who is essentially can be thought of as a Sufi saint, sort of the master at the heart of a Sufi tradition, you have a heritable form of religious authority, where particularly in China, this has a tendency to go sort of father to son, although not always. And it's also worth noting that the devolved nature of governance at the local level within the Qing gave a lot of space for the development of this kind of organization. And likewise, that to a certain extent, these Sufi communities didn't necessarily look that unusual within the religious landscape of imperial China. Communities were often run by temple associations of various sorts, and in that sense, Sufi and Muslim religious associations didn't necessarily look all that different from any of the other associations who were also playing a role in local governance. Nevertheless, prior to the 1850s, it's a diverse and occasionally fractious religious scene across the Northwest. In particular, there's a famous and very bloody rebellion in 1781, which was largely the result of the Qing mishandling a feud between two different Sufi associations. But I join Tristan Brown in emphasizing overall that in the mid-imperial period, Muslims in China cannot be seen entirely as a community apart. That to a certain extent, being Muslim in China through that period was not something that occasioned suspicion. It was simply part of the fabric of daily life, and these networks of shrines, of mosques, were integrated into local governance. They were often patronized by local officials in the same manner as other temples. And for my purposes, it's worth noting actually that it's often very hard to track Muslim population in Gansu and Shanxi prior to the 1860s, simply because most of the time, people didn't bother to record it. It was not of concern. So on to the rebellion that sits very much at the heart of most of my work. It's certainly the point at which most of my work begins. This is a painting from the set that was commissioned to celebrate the victory by the court in 1885. Whether you can celebrate a victory of a rebellion that lasted some 10 years, depending on how exactly you date it, and which is said to have killed 8 to 12 million people. Some accounts say 2 in 3, leaving entire villages depopulated, is another matter. It's at the population of Gansu, about 100 years to recover in numerical terms. And as part of that process, Lu Weidong estimates that the rebellion left over 90% of the Muslim population of Shanxi either dead or missing. The rebellion, in most accounts, is normally referred to as the Great Northwestern Muslim Rebellion. You'll sometimes hear it referred to as the Jungian Rebellion, but most of the names have this in common. It is termed both a rebellion and specifically a Muslim rebellion. It's defined as one. However, I would emphasize that there's actually a lot of retrospective narrative creation going on here. It certainly became a Muslim rebellion, largely when Muslims were blamed for the violence. And in truth, it was really a collapse of the state. And that explains partly why the rebellion is actually very, very hard to talk about, because that collapse happened differently across the different spaces of the Northwest. And there isn't really a single narrative to the rebellion at all. It was very much catalyzed by the chaos of civil war occurring elsewhere in China at the time, particularly the Taiping Rebellion, the Nian Rebellion, that meant that the silver transfers that the military establishment of the Northwest, never the most economically profitable region of the empire, depended on, were disrupted, eventually leading to a cycle of violence that basically the state no longer had the capacity to control. The general narrative, when talking about it, is that it began in Shanxi in 1862 with a marketplace dispute between a hand seller and a Muslim buyer, and then spread west. It was a tense atmosphere at the time, basically compounded by violence elsewhere, and basically increasing poverty across the regions in question. But to emphasize the bit where there are a variety of stories to this rebellion. In Qinghai, it really begins 2 years before it did in Shanxi in 1860, with a dispute between two different groups of Muslims that began in Tibetan markets. The violence, however, across the region escalates with the transfer of troops away. Inet attempts to handle it, exacerbate matters, particularly when officials in Shanxi took the part of the Han, the non-Muslims, in assigning blame. With the result that officials in the area, in order largely to conceal their own failures, increasingly scapegoat the Muslim population of the area as basic to explain the violence and their inability to control it. And there is a process essentially of radicalization that takes place as essentially Muslims in the area are pushed into joining rebel forces. Increasingly, as attempts to negotiate break down, Shanxi collapses into violence, refugees are pushed west into Gansu, troops elsewhere mutiny for lack of pay. And the violence itself here has to be thought of as a process. There are places in Gansu and Shanxi where local officials and local communities work hard to attempt to overcome the characterization of the rebellion as essentially a Muslim affair. They work to try and build alliances between sort of Muslims and non-Muslims in the community. However, with the increasing tension of the atmosphere, rumors of massacres occurring elsewhere, these almost always break down and end in violence. Nevertheless, it never really becomes a united rebellion. And in that sense, it's not a rebellion at all. By 1866, you have more or less 4 separate Muslim centers that have emerged in Shanxi and Gansu. None of them ever coordinate to any great degree. In Qinghai in particular, there's complicated Tibetan involvement on both sides. And there are a large number of Han combatants as well. It's just that in the official writings of this, they're always termed bandits rather than rebels. After years of fighting, eventually Zhou Zontang and the Xiang army are sent in to deal with the northwest. And under Zhou's leadership, the army slowly but steadily progresses essentially from the east up the Hershey corridor and eventually into Xinjiang, and driving essentially more refugees from Shanxi into Gansu as they go. Forces that surrender are incorporated en route. And as the fighting ends, reconstruction in the wake of the rebellion, the attempt to rebuild society begins. And this is at the core of what my research attempts to address, what this process meant and what it did. So we need to think a little bit about who this person was, Zhou Zontang, the leader essentially of the Qing reconquest. As the quotation from Zhou indicates, Muslim rebellion in the Northwest, and it was always defined as one by the officials involved, was viewed as qualitatively different from the other rebellions of the 19th century, Civil War period, and in need of a different solution. Zhou's analysis for reconstruction was that essentially Muslims could not live peacefully alongside non-Muslims. And henceforth, if peace was to be assured in Gansu and in Shanxi in the interim, first of all, Muslims should be separated from non-Muslims through a program of resettlements. This was to be followed by a program essentially of cultural education in order to ensure that the Muslims of China became, at least publicly, disciplined into a form that would render them administratively legible, would prevent this sort of conflict ever reassuring. Zhou repeatedly emphasized that he didn't intend them to give up their faith entirely, simply for it to become a private matter that did not affect their public handling of affairs. It's worth noting that Zor was, in some senses, quite a different kind of official from those who had previously staffed the Northwest. He was a self-made man who had got his start fighting against the Taiping Rebellion, an affiliate of the statecraft school of governance, and committed to what has been described by Eric Schlussel as effectively a sino-normative view of the world, i.e. not a world of diversity. And hence the program that he envisaged was much more radical than anything had ever been tried in the Northwest before. Alongside his resettlements of Muslims away from non-Muslims, the initiatives proposed included education to put Muslim youth through Confucian academies, movement restrictions on Muslims, particularly a ticketing system to ensure that they could not leave their local areas, effectively the definition of Muslims within a local census, so that people henceforth were marked as either Muslim or non-Muslim, a much more systematic monitoring of Muslim population, and a corresponding process of memorialization to deal with the aftermath of basically this mass violence. Most of these initiatives were honestly not massively successful, but it's the resettlements I want to focus on tonight because that is the one part of the program that did go ahead and which can still very much be seen on a map today. So this is, courtesy of the Online Spiritual Atlas of China, a map of religious sites in China, and the green spots mark the mosques, basically. And the area we're looking at is really this one. And when I say that the resettlements can be seen on a map today, this is because you can see basically this gigantic gap through these two tight clusters of Muslim settlement. And that is a direct result of the way in which Muslims were moved and resettled away from strategic areas in the wake of this rebellion. The resettlements themselves were based on the idea largely that a good person was a farmer who did not leave their village safe to go to market, based on the idea that basically people should be immobile, and that this is how the local economy ought to function. Hence the idea that if you put the Muslims in the right place, you stop them from moving, eventually they would become effectively peaceful. And in terms of like how influential this was, if we take a look at essentially a close-up of the area immediately around Ningxia, and this I would emphasize again is a modern map, a modern mapping of religious sites. In Zor's program, the River Tao was designated as the line dividing Muslim from non-Muslim. So to the west of that river, in the area around Ningxia, Muslims were permitted to remain and the Han were moved out. To the east of it, the Muslims were moved away, often into the west. And so the settlement geography of Gansu today is very much directly a result of the impact of this rebellion. In terms of breaking down exactly what that did to the Muslim population, we can talk of it in terms of essentially two zones of absence, namely the Heshi corridor and Shanxi, these areas where Muslims were moved out of, and in two zones of concentration, which again, I am roughly labeling as Hezhou and Ningxia, where Muslims were moved into, creating these dense zones of concentration. Where Muslims were either moved in or permitted to remain. There are obviously quite a lot of consequences of this. I mean, among the most obvious ones include the fact that henceforth, post-rebellion, there was increasingly much less by way of mixed settlement, far fewer villages in which you found both Han and non-Han present, with perhaps fairly obvious consequences for relationships between those two populations that I'm not going to get into. But I'd like to return to this topic of basically what this did to Islamic networks and Islamic community in the northwest of China as a result. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk briefly about the rough impacts of the resettlements for 3 of these areas, the Hershi Corridor, Ningxia, and Shanxi, before moving into a more detailed examination of Hezhou, Linxia, the place that became China's little Mecca. And in terms of talking about this, for those 3 places, particularly Shanxi and the Hershi Corridor, they can very much be characterized in terms of loss. Although obviously, I'm generalizing a bit. It's challenging to document loss, it always is. It's always hard to document an absence, especially when there are comparatively few records for understanding what the Islamic culture of the Hershi Corridor would have looked like. We have more information for Shanxi, but nevertheless, I've worked hard to try and find strategies for talking about what I think ought to have been there. And these accounts that I'm about to give are built up very much from bits and pieces, from mosque histories where they exist, where the mosques were eventually refounded, from memorials written at the time on the requisitions of Muslim property by the state, particularly mosques and gongbei, from oral histories, most of which were collected in the mid-20th century and come with issues of their own, and also from silsila, from Sufi traditions, which often show, in terms of like the histories of the masters, movement or presence through areas that now do not really have Sufi presences at all. And so, particularly in terms of like the pre-rebellion religious culture of the Hershi Corridor, I'm arguing that potentially we're looking at a lost set of Sufi centers for the northwest of China. It's hard to know. There clearly were significant communities of Muslims in the cities of the Hershi Corridor, and particularly the cities now known as Jiangye and Wuwei. So that would be Suzhou and Liangzhou. You can tell this partly simply from the accounts of the fall of Jiangye. By my estimates, at least 8,000 Muslims were massacred when that city fell in 1868, 69, apologies. And in the accounts written of that battle, over 6,000 of those are described as local, which in a city which probably numbered about 30,000 people gives you a good sense of quite what a significant proportion of the population this was. Any survivors, well, of families who escaped by various means, had their former lands confiscated and were relocated to the southeast of Gansu. Likewise, in terms of the mosques there, you can see the impact of this period. The Jungian Mosque, which was founded in the late Ming or perhaps the early Qing, so it's another very historic mosque, was demolished in the 1870s reconquest of the city. And it wasn't rebuilt until 1915, when the area came under the rule of military commanders who had actually originated in Linxia, and following basically a new migration of Muslims into the area. But my point is partly, we don't know what was lost. It's hard to know, or nearly impossible, to work out anything about the history of the mosques that were never rebuilt. But from the silsila, from surviving Sufi traditions, we have at least some sense that there was a very dynamic Sufi culture active in the cities of the north of Gansu. In particular, I've been working with a document called the Liangzhou Zhuang silsila, which is unusual in that it records Khalifa as well as masters, which shows a number of masters active in the Hershi Corridor, traveling between Qinghai, Suzhou, and Urumqi. Post-rebellion, of course, the lineage relocates entirely to Ningxia. It is now completely absent from the north of the corridor. And essentially, I think, in terms of what we're missing in terms of understanding Islam in China, particularly historically, this should have been the region that linked the Xinjiang religious traditions to the Sufi traditions of Hezhou. Its obliteration, the fact that I cannot give a definitive list of what shrines, what mosques, what communities should have been there, means we're missing an entire chapter of the story of Sufism in China. To go back briefly, to talk about these other regions, Shanxi, very obviously, the Muslim population is more or less completely gone. The only significant community of Muslims in Shanxi that survived the rebellions was that in Xi'an, which obviously still has a very famous mosque. But they too were under very strict pressure after the rebellion. Entry of Muslims into the city was very tightly policed. Xi'an gentry were made responsible for admitting Muslim traders to the city, if at all. And elsewhere, across the rest of the province, Muslims were not permitted to return, very, very strictly. And whatever was there by way of Muslim architecture and institutions was appropriated by the state and often turned into memorials to the rebellion itself. So Xi'an had been a teaching center. Imams from Hezhou, from Ningxia, from the rest of Gansu often studied there prior to the rebellion. But post-bellum, its importance was significantly reduced simply because of the limit to what could be done in that city. In terms of the third area, which I'm only going to speak about very briefly, the cluster of Muslim settlement in Ningxia. In terms of differences that can be seen today, there is still a divide between the Shanxi Muslims who were resettled largely into the south of that region and the communities who essentially had been there all along. It's noticeable in the accents in particular. In terms of the 19th century, there were lasting differences in the treatment of the resettled Shanxi Muslims, who were seen all by the state being as basically borderline rebels and who needed to be treated with the utmost suspicion, as opposed to Gansu Muslims, who I would not say were treated favorably by the state, but they were treated slightly better in terms of gaining permissions to travel. In Ningxia, and in Pingliang and in Jiangjiachuan, Muslim communities rebuilt themselves. Most famously, you have the Joharya Sufi order, whose former stronghold at Jinjibu and their leadership was wiped off the map during the rebellion, who re-established themselves slowly, sheltered by a military leader who had fought for the Qing. The shrines were rebuilt, surviving descendants of the Sheikh were rescued, and a mythic tradition formed around essentially the experiences of martyrdom, violence, and dispossession. So once again, you see a reformulation of a tradition around the traumatic experiences of the 1860s. For scholarship on the Joharya, which again, I'm not going to go into in too much more detail, I recommend the work of Anthony Garneau and Guntien Ha. But again, in Ningxia, it's a slow process, particularly for those resettled who arrived with almost nothing into those communities. As one correspondent to the 1950s oral history surveys that were done of this area reported, the experience of being resettled had doomed them to a century of poverty. And so now I'd like to move to talk about the final one of these concentration areas that I've identified, Hezhou, Ningxia as it became, the exception to the pattern above. Hezhou and its neighboring areas suffered during the war, but they were not leveled in the way that the cities of the Heshi corridor or those of Ningxia were. The Muslim leadership of Ningxia surrendered at a very timely point. Their surrender was accepted. And as a result, they then participated, particularly the leadership, Ma Jiao, Ma Qianling and their sons, participated in the rest of the campaign for the Qing, fighting against the remaining rebels in the Heshi corridor, building trust with Zhou and his armies. They remained in place in their communities, and with the Qing state struggling to rebuild, because at this point we really start to see the limits of the capacity of the state to actually affect the kind of transformation that Zhou wished to see, they were the automatic partners, given that they knew the local area in a way that most Qing administrators did not, to deal with the complexities of rebuilding. Archives were burned, infrastructure in ruins, especially in the vicinity of Ningxia as well. It's a very multi-ethnic area, it's multilingual. It is essentially very challenging for most magistrates to get a grip with, given that structure of the Qing state means that none of them were local. And so internally, it led rather to the emergence of a new generation of leadership, largely derived from the Muslim military leaders who had risen to prominence during the rebellion, and who had then been able to essentially clear their names through military service to the Qing. So they were, many of them had some sort of religious status. The most important of these leaders, Ma Jiao, had trained as an ahong, as an imam, but when in his dealings with the states, he'd never appear as a religious professional. He would always appear as basically a military leader. And perhaps crucially, in terms of talking about the ways in which the rebellion starts to change the religious structure of the Northwest, Ma Jiao was not a sheikh. He was not. He was only loosely associated with the Sufi lineages that had previously dominated politics in the Northwest. They were effectively also made responsible to a certain extent for what happened in their local areas. However, within that, the details of what actually happened in those local communities, until something went wrong, the Qing officials did not have time or capacity to really bother about. Hence, despite official attempts to persuade Muslims to take the formal imperial examinations, to study the classics, and to prohibit heterodoxy of Islamic belief, provided there was no basically active disturbance within the community, these leaders in the Ningxia area, Ma Jiao and Ma Qianling, had significant latitude to basically do as they please, confident that essentially their military positions would protect them, provided there was no wide-scale outbreak of violence. With the result that in Ningxia and its environs post the 1860s, we see effectively an Islamic Renaissance marshaled by those same military leaders. They were able to barter their position with the Qing into wealth, particularly in terms of in land and in wood, and use that wealth to fund the reconstruction of the local area, to pay for scholars to go on pilgrimage, to invite imams to teach in the local mosques. And it's noticeable that in this particular area, unlike the rest of Gansu, where the building of mosques is very heavily policed by the state in this period, the number of mosques in this region expands in the late 19th century. It's also with this concentration of people, this concentration of Muslims, denser perhaps than it ever had been before, the relative security for Muslims in that area brings in teachers displaced from elsewhere. And so in the late 19th century in Ningxia, we see a number of extremely charismatic teachers active, mendicant Sufis, the formation of a number of new religious traditions, a rise in the number of people taking Hajj pilgrimages, often funded to do so by the military leadership themselves, and hence an increase in the number of connections between Ningxia and basically the Islamic centers of Central Asia and ultimately the Middle East. In terms of thinking about how this functioned on the ground, and I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip through some of the rest of this. This translates into very active placemaking projects, brokered by those leaders within their villages. Particularly, they are active in mosque building, given that they are justifying themselves to their communities, even as their continued military service justifies them to the state. So if we take a look briefly at, this is the home village of Ma Jiao, perhaps the most famous leader of the Ningxia rebellion. This village is more or less a complete creation of his authority in the post-1860s world. The mosque that stands in the center of the walls, given that mosques in this period were not supposed to be inside walled settlements, was built through the patronage of his son, Ma Anliang. Likewise, his shrine, built after his death, again, something that should not have actually happened according to Qing regulations, dominates the village around it. The grave of Ma Jiao actually still stands in the center of that village. And Ma Anliang was able to effectively barter imperial permission to build such an institution, largely by, apparently, by donating for famine relief elsewhere in Gansu, and thereby gaining permission to build the site, which has parallel inscriptions in Chinese and Arabic, both of which present a very different view of who these people were and their relationships to their community. The Chinese inscription very much emphasizes service to the state, particularly military, and loyalty to the Qing. The Arabic emphasizes Ma Jiao as essentially an Islamic leader who protected his community through a time of difficulty, buying them a space within the Chinese state where they could be themselves, where the mosque could be inside the walls, where they could be protected from protected from the, I guess, the rest of society, really. In particular, you see a number of developments at the time brokered by these leaders that start to change the way that mosques relate to each other as well. All of these leaders are very active in funding mosques, but likewise ensuring that increasingly the mosques that they are funding have influence over the surrounding religious communities as well. So they fund the mosques at the center of these villages to be essentially what is known as Hayyi mosques, Hayyi being derived probably from the Ottoman Turkish for center, a system where a central mosque directs the religious affairs of the smaller surrounding mosques subordinated to it, dispatching imams to them, in a fashion that essentially started to increase the control that these same military leaders had over the religious affairs of not just their immediate community, but the surrounding ones outside it. I'm going to actually skip forward a little bit to talk about why this matters. The Hayyi system is associated ultimately with the arrival of the Ikhwan in the later 19th century, a reformist anti-Sufi group who advocated largely a return to core texts, purification of pronunciation in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And what it indicates really is a changing conception of the relationship between belief and community leaders, and the structure of mosques and believers and the community of believers in Gansu and in the northwest of China. Previously, mosques had largely been independent of each other, free to conduct their own affairs as they willed, more or less. This change indicates the start of a process by which Muslims in this area are effectively encouraged to identify their interests as a community, where the affairs of one mosque become explicitly linked to the affairs of others, and the ability to control religious affairs becomes basically a key requirement for, to a large extent, the safety of those communities as a whole. And in the transformation of these communities in the late 19th century by these religious leaders, we see really the beginnings of something that is approaching a Muslim modernity, the promotion of an Islam that is explicitly not Sufi, that is explicitly opposed to the authority of the Sufi brotherhoods. And it represents largely the attempt of these new Muslim leaders, this new generation who had emerged from the rebellion, to find a place for their own traditions within a postbellum world. It's both from a need or a genuine reformist impulse and a need to find security and preserve that space for Islamic villages within Gansu, by preventing basically any possibility of the community splitting in a way that will promote a Qing crackdown. So to conclude, really, what I'm arguing today is that Ningxia emerged as China's little Mecca, largely because it was the only Islamic center of Gansu and Shanxi to emerge from the rebellion, more or less unscathed. It was the only one that actually survived. The new generation of leadership who emerged from the rebellion as well further reorientated the networks of trade, of patronage and capital to center on Ningxia, both providing a space that could actually foster Islamic community, largely because they were able to represent their communities to the state, and reorientating the ways in which their communities related to each other and to the state. The Northwestern Islamic landscape, as hopefully I've demonstrated through this talk, was fundamentally transformed by the process in this period. It's particularly the networks of religiosity, the ways in which we think about the communities today. None of them make sense without a proper understanding of what these resettlements did to Gansu, the ways in which they transformed the faith, and the possibilities that were erased as a process of that. To a certain extent, the Islamic landscape that we look at in the Northwest, and when we say China's little Mecca, is a result of these immense losses and the ways in which the community has rebuilt and reorientated itself around them in the following century and a bit. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to leave it there and hand back to Alison for a Q&A.
Okay, thank you very much, Hannah, for a very interesting lecture. I learned many things. We are going to take questions now. So I wonder if you could use the chat, which is just below the image on your screen. You can just see it there if you'd like to put any questions to Hannah. I've got one question just to start off, Hannah. You mentioned that during the Qing period in Ningxia, they were able to invite imams to teach in local mosques, and they were able to go on pilgrimage, so, etc. And I wondered if you could elaborate on the relationships that there were with Muslim communities outside China in that period.
Of course. So again, it makes sense to take this question in terms of both sort of the pre-rebellion experience and the post-rebellion experience. Ningxia, and to a certain extent, I think a lot of Islam in China, has the experience of being Muslim in China is often, I think, the experience of feeling as though you're at the edge of a Muslim world. There has always been sort of a pressure among those communities to remain current, if you like, particularly following the loss of Arabic and Persian as spoken languages for the community, which was probably occurred during the late Ming, with the result that Sufism itself, as it arrives in China, is partly an expression of that particular impulse. You have these charismatic masters in the 17th and 18th century who journey to the Western centers, often Yemen, are initiated into these Sufi lodges and return bearing sort of the religious secrets, the texts, and then transmitting them to their communities, building up these charismatic communities of followers. And that's where a lot of their religious charisma comes from, this association with those centers abroad, and sort of the power of their traditions. And so in that sense, the communities always are connected to these religious networks. It varies a lot, like how much contact is possible. And in the late 19th century, it becomes, you're starting to see sort of the beginnings of the entry of Chinese Muslims into essentially a global world. It's sort of what I think it was Niall Green called the age of sort of steam, and the ability basically of a much wider section of the population to actually make these journeys to the West in the first place. In the 17th century, these were absolutely the exceptional individuals who were able to journey to Yemen and return with sort of those Sufi initiations. In the 19th century, particularly with the patronage of this powerful new class of landlords, there's a much wider spectrum of people who are able to do that. And with the result that in the 19th century, you see actually a real diversity of basically the religious field in Islam in China through that period. You see the arrival, most obviously, of the tradition that is going to become the Ikhwan, which can be termed sort of a form of like anti-Sufi reformism, as I said. But you also see basically the reinvigoration of a number of Sufi traditions, again, sort of driven by the pilgrimages that are funded by these leaders, who then return sort of with new ideas. You also see the arrival at the time of a number of missionaries into the area as well. So Maja'al is known to have had a teacher from Bukhara. There are, again, it's quite hard to trace for this early period, but there's an individual who gets arrested in Lebanon in about 1899 for selling Quran. Selling what I think ought to have been sort of religious texts. It's termed Quran in the text that I have, but it's probably a much wider spectrum of things. And essentially because of the way that the Islamic community in the northwest of China has been transformed by the rebellions, most of this activity is happening in Ningxia, in Hezhou, because that is the place where basically they're all able to go. But there is a kind of precursor there to the sort of experimentation and reformism that is going to sort of invigorate Chinese Islam through the Republican period, if that makes sense.
Yes, no, thank you. I'm just seeing if there are any questions. There's one which is a very general one, which I think I just might rephrase a little bit, asking about the future of Muslims in China, but perhaps you might like to say something on the legacy in Ningxia at the moment for Islam. I mean, it seems a very strong and vibrant community from what you've said. Would you say that?
So in terms of the legacy of the rebellions, it's one of the reasons I'm interested in talking about this rebellion so much is partly because it's actually very poorly known. It does not feature in state curriculums for education, unlike parallel events at the time, particularly the Taiping Rebellion. And that's partly because it's quite hard to talk about. It is a rebellion that was marked by a high degree of ethnic violence, which the state still doesn't know quite how to deal with. And there is a concern that talking about this rebellion will essentially cause further violence by exacerbating divides between Han and Hui. So to a certain extent, particularly in terms of research, this topic is often nearly off limits for a lot of researchers. I've got quite a lot of friends who don't wish to publish on it just because they're worried about potentially getting into trouble. In terms of what the actual communities know, so in this sense, I have a confession to make. I'm a failed oral historian. I went to Ningxia expecting to find oral narratives of the rebellion, and by and large, I didn't. I think there are a couple of reasons for that. Partly, the 20th century in Ningxia was quite violent. If you talk about rebellion, to a certain extent, there's only so much space, I think, that people have for this kind of story before everything gets confused into each other. And so quite often you'd find that stories that could have been about the 1860s were instead being ascribed to 1928. Or when I asked about the 1860 people, it would instead tell me about 1895. But I think more than that, it's actually because there isn't a real, in some senses, the memory of the 1860s in Ningxia is not nearly so urgent as it is for the communities that were dispossessed. So the place where you do find really quite deep oral narratives of the rebellion are in the relocated Shanxi communities, in most of whom are in Pingliang and in Zhangjiachuan and in bits of Ningxia, where, I mean, they still have the accents from their original communities. In many cases, they retained the names of the villages they were originally from in Shanxi. So their villages are now termed there as well. They have also this generational memory almost of having been doomed to poverty by the experience of their ancestors through this period. By contrast, I think in Ningxia, because frankly, this generation of military leadership went on to become very wealthy and very powerful, there isn't that experience of victimization that's come out of it in the same way. The traumas for that community are different, basically. They are related to different events. And as a whole, likewise, I should mention the religious, particularly the Sufi traditions, who have quite rich oral histories and quite rich histories of their own, often have very deep memories of this as well, in terms of like the experience of the Sufi masters, the ways in which they were forced to travel or migrate or persecuted by the state. There's a lot in that. What there isn't for most of these people is a frame in which to sit this history, if that makes sense. Everybody has a little bit of individual history, but it's nobody, because it's not talked about much, it's not discussed much, very few people have a sense of the scale of the events and the way it affected an entire swathe of Gansu and of Shanxi. It's limited to sort of family history telling, almost divorced from an awareness of what the rest of the period looked like. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. Well, in fact, you've sort of answered the other one, which was asking about the awareness of the way in the Northwest of the loss suffered in the 19th century, which I think you sort of covered there. We have talking about the silsila, you mentioned that you consulted the silsila to get a history of the uprising beyond the state narrative, which you've also just really covered with your attempts at reaching an idea through oral history. But the final part of that question was, has the memory of the 1860s and 70s uprising been affected by subsequent violence in the Republican and the PRC periods?
Yes, is the short answer to that. Partly because, particularly if you're looking for family histories, it becomes a little bit vague beyond a certain time back. Rebellions have a tendency to get sort of, in tellings, they get kind of squashed into each other. It's also, I think, particularly if we're talking specifically about Ningxia rather than about the other communities, again, Ningxia sort of escaped the worst of the violence of the 1860s in a lot of ways. The town remained largely intact, despite horrific violence happening around it, if that makes sense. That's not true of some of the later incidents, particularly 1928, in which the suburb of Bafang, that site of the 8 mosques, was burnt more or less to the ground. And so that as an incident that sort of dominates the local history memory as something that affected everybody who lived through it, does also dominate sort of the oral history telling as well. It's also, particularly in 1928 in southern Gansu, has very live repercussions for both several of the religious traditions that lived through it, and indeed in terms of producing further flows of refugees. There was significant fighting in 1928 in a county neighbouring to Hezhou, and with the result that questions, particularly over 1928, and questions of blame largely are still very much unresolved. They're still extremely sensitive for those traditions because to a certain extent they've never been discussed. It's all sort of there's a lot of secrets held about it, and a lot of blame. It's still floating around the community, and so it does tend to dominate the historical narrative. I think perhaps more directly to answer the question, I apologise, that was not the most coherent of answers. If we're talking overall, each of these events, so if we talk about Muslim rebellion in China, very often you'll get a series of dates. You get 1781, 1784, you get the 1860s, you get 1895, you get 1928. And particularly from the perspective of outsiders, these get fitted quite straightforwardly into a narrative of Muslim rebellion. And as a result, you wind up with a history that concentrates on instances of violence, which it flattens both the temporal distance and the institutional changes that occurred between these time periods, which means that you get 1781, which was a rebellion that began from a feud between two Sufi traditions, talked about in the same breath as the violence of 1928, when a Muslim military commander turned on essentially the rest of the Muslim military commanders for reasons that are frankly still quite unclear, as though they are the same thing, as though they fit into the same narrative, as though all of this can be explained simply by the fact that they are Muslim and eventually they will rebel. I think fitting them into a narrative that puts all of these incidents in the same timeline is a little bit misleading. They are very, very different. Although some of the combatants are Muslim in all of them, they cannot be flattened into one narrative of Muslim rebellion that ignores the temporal and institutional differences between those times.
Right, thank you. I have just one question here. Sorry, just they're coming in very quickly. Just trying to get it to get out. This question is, in 1930s publications, there's mention that the Muslim populations of this area were deemed to be Japanese collaborators. Have you come across this in the oral histories?
No, is a short answer. I would be very surprised if I did. This is partly because most of the people I was talking to, certainly when I was doing oral history, were Muslim. And I would not expect anybody to ever tell me of a history of Japanese collaboration. In terms of the little bit of interviews that I've done with non-Muslims in the area, they are marked by a high degree of generally suspicion of Muslims a lot of the time, like memories of violence, colouring basically the perceptions that both sides have of each other. But I've never actually heard that one about Japanese collaborators. Interestingly, it is something that I've seen in histories of the time, actually. It's a claim that turns up in one of the most influential histories of Gansu, the Ningxia Shilua, which was a Republican-era history written by a Kuomintang intellectual in the 1930s. He mentions that this is a possibility. I've never seen anything to back it up, either in oral or governmental sources.
Thank you. Just got a few more. Could you say a bit about whether the rebellions of the mid-18th century, initiated by the Joharya leader Ma Ming-shin, are referred to in 19th century rebellions by either state officials or rebels?
Yes, is the short answer. So the mid-18th century rebellions in Ningxia set the framework by which the Qing state understands Sufi rebellions henceforth. So particularly in that rebellion, which originates in a conflict between two different Sufi orders, the Joharya, as led by Ma Ming-shin, and the Hufeiya, as led by Ma Guobao. The state intervenes at a point where essentially open conflict has broken out between the two, more or less. It makes a judgment at the time that essentially the problem here is one of orthodoxy, that Islamic communities in China were, broadly speaking, peaceful until the arrival of the Joharya, the new teaching, the newest Sufi order to arrive. And that thus it is the new teaching here that is the problem. They are the rebels, that if everybody went back to being orthodox and to having a unified tradition, then there would not be this, basically this conflict would not have occurred. And the terms they use, literally the new teaching and the old teaching, are applied repeatedly to every other instance of basically Islamic conflict in 19th century and indeed 20th century China as well. It's a framework that both officials try to use to understand what they are seeing in front of them, in that they try to search out like which is the orthodox teaching this time, which is the unorthodox one that should be suppressed. And it is a framing that Sufi orders themselves take on in terms of how they describe themselves, and particularly how they describe themselves to the state. They effectively attempt to describe claim the discourse high ground of claiming themselves to be the old teaching, therefore the orthodox teaching, that is permitted by the state and protected by it, regardless of how they actually, basically what their teaching actually involves, or whether it is indeed an innovation for like Islam in that area or not. It becomes actually very confusing. A lot of the time, the Qing state officials do not really have a very good understanding of what they're looking at. And likewise, the oral histories, again, are very much trying to put forward their own particular viewpoint. It more or less drops out of use by the end of the Qing, partly because by that point, we are dealing with, by the conflicts then you have very often you have an old teaching, a new teaching, a new teaching, a new flourishing teaching. You've reached a point where this terminology is quite clearly broken for the point of view of describing anything. But it's quite a powerful framework. And its persistence says a lot about the way in which Islamic leadership in Gansu and Qinghai would use the Qing courts often as a forum in which to bring their disputes, for all that they were bringing them to basically a non-Muslim court and looking to draw upon that authority. I hope that sort of answers the question.
That's what I think we'll finish with this one. You've covered the first part, I think, really, wondering how this experience of rebellion is remembered among the Wei, and how this memory has shaped the Wei's approach to dealing with the Chinese state today. The second bit is something that you haven't really touched on.
The Hui approach to dealing with the state today. Now, that's a tricky question. I mean, I think I would emphasize that the Hui, Chinese Muslims, Chinese Islam, are very diverse. There is a huge difference between the Islamic community in a place like Ningxia, where, at least in certain areas, Muslims are more or less a majority, versus the Hui in, well, the one mosque in Jungian that now survives, given that all the rest of them were cleared out, or the Muslim communities of the East Coast, which are different again. And so strategies for the Hui vary massively across China. Like it would be unreasonable to expect there to be necessarily some sort of unity there. And in terms of talking about the way in which it has approached the Chinese state today, I don't know that this rebellion is necessarily always the most relevant thing to be referencing, if that makes sense. It was a long time ago. Certainly in terms of state-Hui dealings, there's been a lot of water under the bridge since then. But perhaps it does fit into a climate in which, following the 1860s, Muslims in China were perpetually left justifying their loyalty to the state, if that makes sense. They were marked as different in law, they were increasingly marked as different in policy, and for Muslim leadership to justify them, they had to work hard basically to justify themselves as Chinese, basically, as well as being Muslim, to prove that essentially their loyalty to the state was higher than their loyalty to Islam. And that has left, I think, certainly a heritage that you can see in Republican China, and perhaps then that feeds into the later experiences. But in terms of both this, often this need to sort of justify yourself to a state to sort of seek protection from it, and a concern for a state that may crack down on you, there are other relevant incidents as well. I'd highlight the Cultural Revolution in particular, I think. Yes, I think I'm going to leave that there.
Okay. Well, I think we'll finish there and give you a rest. You must be exhausted. But thank you very, very much for a most interesting lecture. And I think there are lots of comments thanking you and saying how interesting it was and how people enjoyed it so much. And Matty will send you those from the chat so you can see them in your own time. So Hannah, thank you very much, and thank you very much to everybody for attending tonight. It was very, very interesting, and we really appreciate it, Hannah. Thank you.